Living in a world ruled by food influencers and picture-perfect meals, it is almost funny to imagine medieval peasants digging into their daily bowl of gruel. No stylish plating or hashtags back then. While we worry about booking a table at trendy restaurants, medieval peasants were just worried about making it through the winter without starving. But those people were nothing if not inventive. They had to be. When you live off the land and every meal depends on what you can scrape together, creativity becomes survival. Unlike modern picky eaters who complain about a bruised apple, medieval peasants made use of everything they could find. And by everything, that meant grinding acorns into flour during lean times, or finding ways to turn wilted vegetables into something edible. Their eating habits reveal much more than what they consumed. They show how tough and adaptable human beings can be when pushed to the edge. And they needed every bit of that toughness, especially when it came to their bread. Because while you might think bread is simple, medieval peasant bread would probably make a modern health enthusiast cry. Forget your golden sourdough loaves. Peasants ate what historians call maslin bread, a mix made from whatever grains they managed to gather. And when I say whatever, I mean whatever. Studies of ancient bread remains have found traces of peas, beans, and even powdered tree bark. That is one way to add fiber. The color was nothing to brag about either. Instead of soft golden loaves, peasant bread was dark, dense, and about as heavy as a stone. There is even a story from a medieval court where someone was accused of assault using a loaf of bread. The judge took it seriously, because these loaves could have doubled as weapons. About 80% of a peasant's daily calories came from bread. That means eating nothing but plain sandwiches all day, except without the filling. And the quality difference was huge. Lords ate fine white wheat bread, while peasants were stuck with what they called horse bread. Yes, it was that rough. In fact, the name came from the fact that it was often used to feed animals. The grain system was tightly controlled too. Peasants were required to grind their grain at the lord's mill and pay a fee for it. Try dodging that rule, and you could get punished faster than you could say bakery. Some peasants tried grinding grain in secret using hand mills, but if they were caught, the penalty was harsh. During poor harvests, which happened quite often, they had to improvise. They mixed in pea flour, bean flour, and sometimes even crushed acorns. You know life is rough when you are competing with squirrels for dinner. Yet some food historians have recreated these recipes, and surprisingly, the acorn bread version is not as bad as you might think. Still, I would rather stick to modern bread. Bread was their staple, but peasants had another clever food to stretch their supplies. It was something called pottage. Think of it as the medieval version of an endless soup. It was not your grandmother's chicken noodle. Pottage was more like a pot of stew that never truly ended. You know how some people keep a sourdough starter alive for years? Peasants did that, only with their stew. They would keep adding to it day after day, sometimes for weeks. The daily cooking ritual went like this. Take whatever vegetables were left: peas, beans, turnips, maybe some cabbage if you were lucky, throw them in a pot with water, and let it simmer slowly while working in the fields. Archaeologists studying old cooking pots have found traces of plants like nettles and ferns. That was their version of eating greens. Interestingly, research on medieval skeletons shows that peasants often had healthier teeth than modern people. Their vegetable-heavy diet actually worked in their favor. Who would have guessed? Though it probably did not do wonders for their breath. The best part of pottage was how it reused everything. Nothing ever went to waste. That hard bread from yesterday? In it went. Old peas or dried beans? They were tossed in too. It was basically the medieval way of cleaning out your pantry before things spoiled. Except they did it every single day. During Lent, the church had one firm rule: no meat. But medieval peasants were experts at finding loopholes. They would see a beaver swimming in the river and say, "Well, it lives in the water most of the time, so it must count as a fish." A little creative thinking later, and suddenly beaver tail pottage was on the dinner table. Medieval problems called for medieval solutions. And honestly, pottage was the perfect dish for that kind of flexible logic. You could not ruin it if you tried. It was supposed to be thick, soft, and almost mushy, so the longer it cooked, the better. Imagine a meal that could never burn, no matter how distracted you got. Medieval cookbook writers did not even bother with exact quantities. Recipes were full of lines like, "Toss in a handful of this," or "add whatever you have around." It was a beginner cook's dream. While pottage was the daily standard, there was another reliable source of food for peasants: fish. And trust me, their fishing adventures were nothing like a calm weekend by the lake. The church banned meat for nearly half the year, around 150 days in total. But fish? That was still allowed. Those religious loopholes saved countless peasants from going hungry, even if they never realized it. But the true stars of medieval rivers were not the usual fish. Eels were the medieval version of takeout food. Archaeologists have discovered eel bones in almost every medieval garbage site. They were so plentiful that some peasants even paid their rent with them. Imagine showing up to your landlord's door holding a bucket of live eels instead of coins. Records reveal that one English village owed its lord more than 80,000 eels each year. Now that is a slimy payment plan. Their fishing methods were just as entertaining. Some peasants built large wooden traps in rivers, known as kittles, which acted like giant underwater mazes. Others went fishing at night with torches and spears, turning the riverbank into something that probably looked like a medieval party. The really clever ones trained birds, called cormorants, to catch fish for them, though the trick was more common in parts of Asia. One of the strangest techniques involved tossing fermented rye dough into the water. The fish would eat it, get dizzy, and float up to the surface. So yes, medieval peasants may have invented drunk fishing. The local lords probably were not amused that grain was being used to intoxicate fish instead of baking bread. But rivers and streams were useful for more than catching dinner. They were also the medieval version of refrigerators. Peasants used cool running water to keep dairy products fresh during the hot months. Of course, every so often, an adventurous fish might swim off with someone's cheese. You could almost picture the scene in a medieval comic strip. The fish trade itself was a massive business. If you ever wondered why fish and chips are so iconic in England, you can thank those medieval fish lovers. Fish was such an important part of the diet that the roads connecting the coast to major cities like London were among the first to be properly maintained. Merchants even had fast routes to speed up delivery before the fish spoiled. It was the closest thing to a medieval food delivery service. Of course, if you could not afford to buy fish or did not have access to a river, you might be tempted to find food elsewhere. That was a risky move. Hunting rules were some of the strictest laws in the land, almost like having a parent watching your every move. Catching deer or wild boar was reserved only for nobles. Even if a deer wandered into your vegetable patch and started eating your crops, touching it could cost you your hand, quite literally. After William the Conqueror introduced the forest laws in the year 1067, huge areas of England became royal hunting grounds. Taking so much as a fallen branch without permission could land you in serious trouble. Still, peasants were resourceful. They looked for what the law did not clearly forbid. Rabbits were not officially protected, so peasants built clever traps to catch them. They also hunted small animals such as hedgehogs and squirrels. It was not glamorous, but in a world where every meal was a challenge, you did what you had to do to survive. It was not exactly a royal banquet, but protein was protein. Archaeological studies of old peasant trash pits have revealed something fascinating. Among the debris were plenty of small animal bones mixed with larger ones that had been carefully cracked open. In other words, peasants were eating the marrow from every animal they could find. They were also experts at the "it fell off a cart" excuse whenever questionable meat showed up in their stew. Poaching was a risky game, though, and the punishments were anything but mild. Court records from 14th century England show that being caught poaching could lead to a huge fine or even hanging. Yet some clever peasants purposely got themselves caught during winter. Their logic was simple. Jail meant shelter and food, which was better than starving in the cold. So yes, medieval prison food could be considered an upgrade. Speaking of jails, there is a story about a group of peasants who were caught poaching a deer. Their defense was that the deer had died from laughing after watching one of them slip in the mud. Amazingly, the judge found the excuse so amusing that he reduced their sentence. Seems humor could save lives, even back then. Of course, when fresh meat was off the table, legally or not, peasants still had another dependable source of nutrition. Most villagers had access to milk from a communal cow. Yes, shared cows were real. It was like the medieval version of a coffee shop, where everyone came for their daily fix. Records from one English village reveal that their cow produced about 2 to 3 gallons of milk each day, divided among 15 families. That is some serious rationing. Fresh milk, however, was mostly for children. Adults drinking plain milk were considered as strange as wearing socks with sandals today. The reason was simple. Without any cooling methods, milk spoiled faster than gossip spread in a small village. To make it last, peasants turned it into cheese and butter. That was nature's own preservation trick. Cheese making was no small task. Archaeologists have unearthed special clay containers with holes in them, used as strainers for curds. Interestingly, many of these tools were decorated with prayers. It seems peasants believed a little help from above was needed to keep the cheese from turning into something rotten. Butter making had its own set of complications. The church banned butter during Lent in some places, but not in others. This inconsistency gave rise to what historians call butter letters, official papers from the Pope that allowed certain people to eat butter during Lent. Some clever German peasants sidestepped the rule entirely by insisting that butter was not food, but medicine. Doctor's orders, they would say, "I must eat this butter." Peasants also invented a surprisingly advanced way to store cheese. They aged it in empty mines where the temperature stayed steady all year long. Some of those underground cheese caves are still in use today. Modern tests have shown that these spaces maintain the perfect level of humidity and coolness for maturing cheese. Clearly, medieval peasants knew their craft. But keeping dairy safe was only half the challenge. Finding something safe to drink was another story. Water in those days could be downright dangerous. Rivers often served as both washing areas and sewers, while wells were easily contaminated with animal waste or worse. One old medical text even warned that drinking too much water could turn a person's liver into a sponge. That was not exactly scientific, but it was not far from the truth either. Their solution? Ale, not the strong kind we think of today. Medieval ale was light and cloudy, with only about 1% alcohol. That is roughly the same amount of alcohol as an overripe banana. The average peasant drank close to a gallon of this mild ale every day. Archaeological findings from cesspits show that nearly every household had its own brewing setup. Brewing was usually done by women, known as alewives. These women were the original small-scale brewers, and some became well known for their special blends. Court records even mention a few who got in trouble for using unusual ingredients to make their ale stand out. One ambitious alewife was caught adding chicken droppings to create extra foam in her brew. It seems that even in medieval times, people were willing to take creative risks to make their drinks more appealing. Medieval quality control was not exactly what you would call government approved. Every village had someone known as the ale taster, probably one of the most enjoyable job titles ever created. These lucky individuals had to sample everyone's homemade brew to check if it was good enough for sale. They used a special drinking cup known as a tankard that had a whistle built into the bottom. Once the drink was gone, they could blow the whistle to ask for another round. That is where the phrase, "wet your whistle," comes from. Modern scientists have recreated medieval ale using clues from archaeological findings, and the results were surprising. The natural brewing process produced a drink packed with nutrients. It was rich in B vitamins from the grains, and the fermentation process made those vitamins easier for the body to absorb. Without realizing it, medieval peasants created the first version of a protein shake. And unlike today's shakes, this one came with a small buzz to make life a little more enjoyable. But ale was not the only way peasants got their nutrition. The countryside around them was like an open-air supermarket, if you knew what to pick and what to avoid. Foraging in those days was a risky game of guess what is edible. Choose correctly, and you had dinner. Choose wrong, and that dinner might be your last. Studies of medieval teeth have shown traces of more than 40 different wild plants. These people were serious about eating their greens. Berries were the medieval version of fast food, quick and portable. Blackberries were so common that they even appeared in legal records as landmarks. Descriptions like, "the murder happened by the blackberry bush," were apparently official location details. Peasants also used small wooden containers made for berry picking, some of which still exist today. You could think of them as medieval lunch boxes. Mushroom hunting was a bit more dangerous. One old manuscript described mushrooms as the devil's bread, likely because eating the wrong kind could send you to meet him. Still, peasants developed clever tricks to test them. One method was to place a silver spoon in the pot while cooking. If the spoon turned black, the mushrooms were considered poisonous. Not perfect, but better than nothing. Nuts were another favorite, basically the medieval version of a protein bar. Archaeologists have uncovered large piles of hazelnut shells near peasant homes. Some sites had so many that it was estimated one family could eat nearly 40 pounds of hazelnuts each year. Call it medieval fitness fuel. Herbs were another important part of their diet and medicine cabinet. Peasants were not just grabbing random plants. They had real botanical knowledge passed down through generations. Studies of old medical manuscripts show they used garlic to treat infections and mint for stomach pain. It was like having a backyard pharmacy centuries before modern medicine. Of course, foraging had its dangers that went beyond poisonous plants. Picking herbs, wood, or flowers from the Lord's property could get you fined or worse. One record from the year 1320 tells of a woman who was punished for collecting flowers on church land. Her excuse? She claimed the Virgin Mary would want her church to look beautiful, so she was only picking weeds. A bold move that earned her a fine anyway. The best part of foraging was how it brought people together. Children learned from a young age which plants were safe to eat, turning plant knowledge into a sort of early scouting badge. Even today, many of the plants medieval peasants gathered, like dandelions and nettles, are appearing again in modern restaurants. It seems those peasants were simply ahead of their time. Through all their creative cooking, smart foraging, and clever use of every resource, they proved one thing very clearly. Medieval peasants truly knew how to make the most out of what little they had.